Hey there, Chrononauts, and welcome to another Time Traveler's Field Guide to History. I'm Nova, here today with my co-host, Horatio.
Thank you, Nova. Chrononauts, have you ever wanted to live out the adventure of being one of the first American pioneers to travel across the West? Not to just play the classic Oregon Trail game from the comfort and safety of an elementary school computer lab, but to experience it firsthand with all its dangers and beauties? If so, then we have a great opportunity for you.
That's right, folks. This week's trip is to the Oregon Trail. Only about 300 miles of the 2,170-mile road still exist today, so you'll have to go way back to the 1800s with us to get the whole experience.
In the early 1800s, the Oregon Trail was used mostly by fur traders and was only accessible by foot or horseback.
So how did we get from that to the iconic covered wagon adventure?
The first wagon to cross the Oregon Trail was in 1836 with missionaries Henry H. Spalding and Marcus Whitman, who traveled to what is now the city of Walla Walla to establish the Whitman Mission. They were the only ones that traveled by wagon that year. The trail as a whole is called the Emigrant Trail, which encompasses all the popular destinations: Oregon, Washington, California, and Utah. But of course, Oregon Trail is how we know it today. The first true group of emigrants to be credited with traveling the Oregon Trail by wagon with the specific purpose of settling the West was the Burleson-Bidwell Party of 1841. They originally set out for California with over 60 people, starting at Independence, Missouri. Due to infighting over poor organization and supplies, about half the group separated in Soda Springs to head towards Oregon. Every year, the number of people traveling the trail would increase. By 1846, more than 5,000 people had completed the trek. The trail was popular with gold seekers heading to California, Mormons heading to Salt Lake City, Utah, and homesteaders heading to Oregon and Washington.
In 1849 alone, more than 20,000 emigrants headed west on the Oregon Trail. It remained a popular venture until 1884, when railroads finally spanned coast to coast and rendered the covered wagon trek obsolete. Overall, it's estimated that somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people crossed the continent on the Oregon Trail.
The vast majority of the pioneers would start their journey in Independence, Missouri, which is located in modern-day Kansas City.
Travelers would buy most of their supplies for the trip right there in Independence, although there are also records of people who would plan for their trip for a year or more while making clothes and blankets and preserving foods by drying them.
There were even a few very popular guidebooks for the trail, which were sold all over, and were popular even in New York City.
There are some staple items that all travelers would have had, but of course each group brought their own personal favorites too. But don't worry, Chrononauts, you'll get a list of what you need to buy. Just make sure that you have enough variety for a 6-month trip.
Dried fruits and vegetables were popular. Canning was a relatively new process at the time and was only available to wealthier travelers, and of course it added to the overall weight. Here is a typical example of the supplies needed for 4 adults from A Handbook to the Goldfields, published in 1859.
Notice that this list recommends a total weight of about 3,000 pounds of supplies, including over 1,000 pounds of flour. This is because travelers needed an entire 6 months' worth of food. In the early days of the trail, people were able to hunt along the way, but eventually there were so many emigrants on the Oregon Trail that surrounding game was overhunted and hard to find. Of course, you should also keep in mind that you are passing through land that is already inhabited by indigenous peoples, and do your best to have as little impact on the land and its resources as possible.
Travelers left Independence in mid to late April, in order to give themselves enough time to complete the trip before winter hits and snows in the mountain passes. They couldn't leave earlier than that because there wouldn't be enough grass on the prairies for their draft animals to eat along the way.
One thing to consider is whether you will travel with just your own small family group or band together with other families. If you want to find travel companions, Independence is the place to do it.
There are many benefits to both ways. Traveling with a group means that there are other people around to help you with things like wagon repair, trading supplies, or contemporary medicine. It also means that you'll have companions for company, cooking together, telling stories, and playing music. However, with bigger parties, river crossings take longer, and you can only travel at the speed of your slowest member. There are also more chances for someone else to get you killed. One of the most common dangers on the trail was fighting with other pioneers. You might catch a stray hunting bullet or be run over by someone else's wagon. More people also means that some diseases spread faster.
Next, consider whether or not you'd like to hire a guide. Try to make sure that the guide you hire has traveled back and forth on the trail a few times already. Often the best guides are former fur trappers and traders who were familiar with the trail before pioneers even started making the trek. With the fur trade dwindling, this was a fairly common career switch.
While on the trail, a standard day of travel would start with pioneers up before dawn to rekindle last night's campfire, brew coffee, and make a warm breakfast of cornmeal or rice with bread and beans that they had prepped the night before.
A typical day's travel was about 15 to 20 miles, with a break for lunch and rest referred to as a nooning. For this break, they typically didn't light a fire, so lunch was served cold and usually consisted of leftovers from breakfast and maybe some dried beef. Most people traveled by foot, and the covered wagons were used for storage for all the supplies they needed along the way. As they traveled, children were often tasked with collecting twigs and buffalo chips for that night's campfire.
Buffalo chips, by the way, are patties of buffalo poop, which were relatively easy to find scattered across the prairie. They burned really well, but also quickly, so travelers had to collect a lot of them for a proper campfire.
The day's journey ended in the early evening in order to have enough light to start the fire, make dinner, and set up camp. Dinner was similar to lunch and breakfast, but was sometimes supplemented with fish or game caught during the day, and each day usually ended with starting beans for the next morning.
Along the Oregon Trail, there are many natural sights to see as well as tourist attractions that are unique to the pioneer journey.
At Soda Springs, enjoy the naturally carbonated hot springs. Many travelers not only bathed but also washed their clothes in the hot water. Just be careful not to drink too much of the water from them, or you might end up with alkaline poisoning, which causes nausea, vomiting, hand tremors, and muscle twitching. Best to avoid that.
There are a few spots along the trail known as the registers of the desert, places where pioneers would carve their names and the date directly into interesting rock formations. Some enterprising people would hang out by these rocks and sell chisels to the people passing by. Register Cliff and Names Hill were such popular sites for this that they were named for it. Another big one was Independence Rock, so named because pioneers knew that they were making good time if they got there by the 4th of July, also known as American Independence Day.
Independence Rock was so popular for carving into that in 1843, a man by the name of John C. Fremont carved a large cross into the rock. On July 4, 1847, a group of Protestant pioneers, who considered the cross to be a symbol of Catholicism, got mad enough about it that they blasted the cross off of the rock, despite the fact that Fremont himself was Episcopalian, not Catholic.
Courthouse Rock, Jailhouse Rock, and Chimney Rock, other popular registers of the desert, have all eroded significantly and look very different today. So Chrononauts will have a unique opportunity to see how these places have changed over time.
And Chrononauts, you'll have a really exciting opportunity in Wyoming at Fort Laramie, also known as Camp Sacrifice, which is about 1/3 of the distance to Oregon. By this point in their travels, pioneers would realize how hard it was to carry non-essential items, and they dumped things that were not essential for surviving the trail. It was the last stop on the flat portion of the trail, which gradually gets rockier as you go. Traveling with things like a grandfather clock or a full iron stove was just more effort than it was worth. During the gold rush of 1849, pioneers even left around 20,000 pounds of bacon outside the fort to reduce the weight of their wagons. This is one of those times when another man's trash really could be your treasure. Imagine what you can learn by taking a look at what people chose to leave behind.
Now remember, the journey along the Oregon Trail was not always easy or safe. It's estimated that about 4% of pioneers died along the trail. One of the ways that they disposed of a recently deceased person was to bury them in the trail itself. They didn't have a lot of time to dig a deep grave, but they wanted to keep animals from digging up the body. By burying them in the road, the wagons and draft animals that would come after them would help pack down the soil, making it much harder for wildlife to dig up. Most people were buried in unmarked graves, but there are also cases of people being buried with actual tombstones or wood planks. So this wasn't a hard and fast rule, but generally pioneers weren't able to spend too much time on the dead when they had to get to their destination before winter.
Fear not, Chrononauts who die on the journey will be resurrected here at Chrononauts Incorporated for a nominal fee.
Out of all the ways you can die along the trail, disease was the biggest killer, estimated to have taken out about 6,000 to 12,500 pioneers. The most common type of disease, by far, was fecal oral disease, which includes cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. These types of diseases spread when a water source is infected with human waste that is carrying one of these diseases.
Because pioneers would follow rivers for much of the trail, infected people might take a bathroom stop or, after they had passed, be buried too close to the water. This would end up infecting the water source, thus spreading the disease further.
Now, Chrononauts, diseases are never fun to get. However, some of these diseases have some particularly nasty symptoms. For example, people who catch dysentery experience diarrhea that would put the worst late-night Taco Bell to shame. Over the course of 24 hours, they pass about 5 gallons of bloody, mucousy diarrhea. 5 gallons is a lot. Have you seen one of those office water coolers? It's the dehydration that ends up killing you if you're unable to drink enough clean water as this disease passes through you. Since people end up passing so much waste, this in turn can easily end up contaminating water sources and passing this disease on to other people.
Other common causes of death on the trail were airborne diseases, like diphtheria and measles. Unlike the fecal oral diseases, these ones have a longer incubation period, so a person can end up spreading the disease throughout the wagon party before they even start showing symptoms themselves. Besides, on the trail there was nowhere to quarantine a sick person, and stopping to take care of them can add time that would cost you your chance of safe passage through the mountains before winter.
At this point in time, people still didn't understand how diseases were spread. Around this time, in 1847, a Hungarian doctor by the name of Semmelweis figured out that the mortality rate of women giving birth went down dramatically when the person helping out with the birth simply washed their hands before helping. So you can see, they hadn't quite gotten a hold of germ theory yet. This is the level of medicine that you will be receiving.
People who got cholera or dysentery on the trail often used cream of tartar or baking soda to help cleanse their system. It may have helped some, but of course it had nothing on antibiotics, guaranteed clean water, and time to rest.
After diseases, the second leading cause of pioneer death was conflicts with the indigenous people. Of course, as travelers on the Oregon Trail, it would be best to keep in mind that you are moving through land that already belongs to other people. During the first few years of the trail, there were very few altercations, and pioneers and indigenous peoples either ignored one another or met up to trade goods.
Since more and more pioneers took to the trail each year, they quickly reached a point where they were overhunting game, making it increasingly difficult to hunt food anywhere near the trail. This is why it's so important to remember to buy enough food at the outset of your journey to last, so you don't have to hunt along the way. This rapid depletion of resources naturally caused conflicts with the indigenous people who, unlike the pioneers, were not just passing through and relied on that game to survive.
Most of the fighting between indigenous peoples and pioneers happened in specific, highly contentious areas, so people who took the trail dealt with this by creating cutoffs or alternate routes to avoid passing through any fiercely defended territories. For instance, in 1862, the Goodall Cutoff was created to avoid any problems around the Snake River in Idaho.
Other possible causes of death include hypothermia, scurvy, drowning, shooting accidents, being run over by a wagon, being hit by a falling tree, floods, animal kicks, childbirth, snake bites, and the occasional lightning strike. And speaking of disaster scenarios, you've likely heard of the Donner Party, a group of about 81 people who got caught in the Sierra Nevada mountains for the winter of 1845. Only 45 of those 81 people survived, and several of the survivors resorted to cannibalism to keep themselves alive until the rescue parties came. Let's talk about how you can avoid making the mistakes they made that led to such a horrifying winter. After all, the benefit of time travel is that you get to have the hindsight before you start the journey.
First off, make sure you leave Independence in April. The Donner Party, also known as the Donner-Reed Party, didn't leave until mid-May. While other pioneers sometimes left this late, it really didn't leave much room for mistakes. It is generally accepted that you wanted to take off in April.
A man named James Reed actually funded and organized this trip, but in October, as the group passed through Nevada, Reed fought with another pioneer and stabbed him to death. After his wife begged the group to be merciful to him, Reed was banished from the wagon train and completed the trail alone. He was the only member of the group to reach California before winter.
For the first portion of the trip, James Reed was the leader, and he relied heavily on the trail guide called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California by Lansford Hastings.
We do not recommend use of this book.
That's right, Chrononauts. Please steer clear of both this book and the Hastings Cutoff. Hastings had hoped to convince as many white pioneers to move to California as possible, as a way of subtly taking over the territory. He wrote this guidebook with that in mind, and so he lied and said that the indigenous people who had lived there had already died and the land was undisputed. He also described a shortcut, known as Hastings Cutoff, that he found while looking at a map. Hastings included this cutoff in his book before he had even traveled it himself. He claimed that this cutoff, which passed through Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada, would take 400 miles off the journey, when in reality it added about 100 miles.
It should be noted that several people, including Hastings himself, who at this point actually had taken his suggested cutoff, warned the Donner Party not to take the Hastings cutoff and to stick to the main trail. So Chrononauts, if you do choose to take a cutoff, make sure that it's a well-traveled one, and pay attention to people who warn you against it. The Donner Party added a whole month to their travel time by taking Hastings Cutoff, and lost a lot of their livestock in skirmishes with the indigenous people in Utah who were defending their territory.
Once the Donner Party reached the Sierra Nevada mountains, they were forced to make camp due to heavy snowfall. Some records indicate that the northern Washoe people, who were native to this area, tried to bring them some food. The Donner Party, however, reacted fearfully and shot at them.
Please remember that if you are in dire straits, others may be trying to help you.
Most people arrived to Oregon City around September, just before winter. Depending on the time, they would either try to secure their own land, start working, or, if they were too late in the year, wait out the winter in a hotel or tent settlement.
Here's a look at what settlers in the Willamette Valley in Oregon could expect to get based on the year they arrived.
If emigrants arrived any time before the first Oregon Constitution was drafted in 1843, there was no organization to control land claims, and it was a bit of a free-for-all. After the drafting of their first constitution, they created a provision that only married couples would get a free section of land, since they wanted to create a community of self-sufficient farmers in the Willamette Valley. One section of land was 1 square mile, or 640 acres.
In 1849, the United States made the Oregon Country into a U.S. territory and created a new provisional government. In 1850, they passed the Donation Land Act, which expanded who could get free land to half a section for single people who arrived before 1850. For those who arrived after 1850, the parcels of free land were cut in half, meaning half a section for married couples and a quarter section for single people. In order to keep the land granted through the Donation Land Act, emigrants were required to live there and work the land for at least 4 years.
In 1854, land was no longer free. Pioneers could buy up to 320 acres at a rate of $1.25 an acre. With the passing of the Homestead Act in 1862, emigrants could claim up to 160 acres for a $34 fee. The act was intended for settling the Great Plains, but applied to Oregon as well. In order to keep this land, they would either live and work on the land for 5 years, or live there for just 6 months and then pay $1.25 per acre.
Of course, Chrononauts, rather than settling down on a farm in Oregon, you'll be transported back to the present day. Thanks for being with us today as we take a look back at an American classic, and we hope you enjoy your trip along the Oregon Trail.
Safe travels through time, Chrononauts, and keep on ticking.